In the winter of 1820, in a farmhouse on the Red River in Robertson County, Tennessee, a man named John Bell lay dying in a downstairs room. His face had begun to fail him months before. The muscles on one side would seize and then go slack, so that he could not always speak and could not always swallow. His family had watched it come on slowly across 3 years, and by the time they gathered around his bed, they had stopped calling it an illness. They had started calling it something else. On the morning of December the 20th, John Bell was found dead, and a small vial of dark liquid was found in the cupboard. And the people in that house believed, with their whole hearts, that a voice in the walls had killed him. This is the story of what happened inside that house. It is also the story of how much of what happened cannot be found anywhere except in a book written 70 years too late. The Bell family came to Tennessee the way most of their neighbors did, by coming from somewhere else. John Bell was born in North Carolina in 1750, in the eastern part of the state, and he married a young woman named Lucy Williams. Around the year 1804, the Bells loaded what they owned and moved west into Middle Tennessee, into a stretch of the Red River country that was still frontier, still thinly settled, still close enough to the edge of things that a family measured its safety in miles to the nearest neighbor. They settled near a place that would later be called Adams Station, and later still, simply Adams. They did well there. That part is documented in the ordinary records of ordinary success. John Bell acquired land, hundreds of acres of it, and worked it in corn and tobacco, the two crops that built fortunes and broke backs across that whole part of the South. He owned enslaved people, and their labor built the farm that made the Bells prosperous. And any honest account of this family has to hold that fact in the room. The Bells were churchgoers, tied into the Baptist congregation, respected by their neighbors, the kind of family whose name carried weight at a barn raising or a burial. For more than a decade after they arrived, nothing about the Bell household would have drawn a stranger's eye. They were exactly what they appeared to be: a large, hard-working, well-regarded frontier family, raising children on good bottomland by a river. It is worth sitting for a moment in the world they lived in, because that world explains a great deal about what came later. Robertson County in the first years of the 1800s was still the edge of the American map. Middle Tennessee had only recently been wrestled from wilderness and from the people who had lived on it long before, and a family that settled the Red River bottoms in 1804 was living a good day's ride from anything that could be called a town. The nearest neighbors were often out of sight of one another. News traveled by horseback and by word of mouth, slowly, and a story told at one hearth might take weeks to reach the next valley. Winters were long and dark and quiet. Nights on an isolated farm were quiet in a way that is difficult to reconstruct now. A darkness without any light in it at all, once the fire burned low. A silence in which every settling timber and every animal in the walls could be heard clearly by a family lying awake in the black. The land itself was tobacco land, and tobacco was the crop that organized the whole of that society. It demanded enormous labor across a long season, from the setting of the plants in spring, through the cutting and the hanging and the slow curing in the barns come autumn. And that labor, on the Bell farm as on the farms around it, was the labor of enslaved men and women, whose names the legend almost never bothers to record. The prosperity that let the Bells acquire hundreds of acres and stand tall in their community was built on people the community held in bondage. The famous story tends to pass over them in a line, mentioning that the spirit troubled the enslaved people of the household as it troubled everyone else, and then moving on. An honest telling has to at least pause where the legend hurries past, and over all of it lay the church. This was a deeply religious community, tied to the frontier Baptist and Methodist congregations, that structured social life as much as they structured belief. Faith on that frontier was not a Sunday abstraction. It was a lived and immediate thing, a world in which the unseen was real, in which affliction could carry moral meaning, in which a preacher's word about sin and judgment landed with genuine weight. That is the ground the whole story grew in. A family and a community for whom a battle between good and evil was not a metaphor, and for whom a voice claiming to be a spirit was a claim that had to be taken with the utmost seriousness. There were a great many children. The two who matter most to this story are the ones the later accounts would circle back to again and again. One was Lucy Bell, the mother, who in every version of the story is treated with a tenderness that is worth noticing and worth remembering when the harder questions come. The other was the youngest daughter, Elizabeth Bell, who everyone called Betsy. Betsy Bell was born in 1806. When the disturbances began, she was somewhere around 11 years old, a girl on the edge of adolescence in a house full of older brothers and the endless work of a working farm. She is the emotional center of everything that follows. Almost every reported event in the Bell Witch story either happens to Betsy, or happens near her, or happens because of her. In the story as it was finally written down, she is slapped and pinched and stuck with pins by something no one can see. She is the one who screams in the night. She is the one whose engagement, years later, becomes the obsession of the thing in the walls. Whatever actually happened on that farm between 1817 and 1820, it happened around an 11-year-old girl, and that is a fact worth carrying carefully through the rest of this account. Around Betsy in that house was a crowd of older brothers, and their names recur through the record because several of them would go on to shape how the story was told. There was John Bell Jr., the eldest of the sons who figures in the events, a grown man during the disturbances, described in the accounts as the one who confronted the voice most directly and was troubled by it least. There was Drury Bell, called Drew, one of the first besides his father to report seeing something strange near the property. There was Richard Williams Bell, only a boy when the disturbances began, and the son whose name would later be attached, decades after his death, to the single most important and most disputed document in the entire case. And there was the youngest boy, Joel Egbert Bell, small during those years, who would live long enough to carry his own memories of the house into old age. These were the people in the rooms, real children of a real family, whose ordinary lives were about to become the material of a legend that would outlast every one of them. At the center of the household stood Lucy Bell, the mother, and the way the story treats her is one of its quiet tells. In nearly every version, whatever else the voice did, it never harmed Lucy. It spoke of her with something close to reverence, called her the most perfect woman living, and in the strangest passages is said to have sung to her and brought her fruit when she was sick in bed. A story invented or embellished by people who loved and admired the mother of the family would look exactly like this: the father tormented and killed, the daughter afflicted, the sons harassed, and the mother alone held gently apart, spared, praised, protected. It proves nothing on its own, but it is the kind of detail that reveals the hand of the people doing the telling, and it is worth holding on to when the sources come under scrutiny later. For more than a decade, this was simply a family. John Bell was an elder in his congregation, a man of standing whose word carried in matters of the church and the community. Lucy kept a large and busy household. The children grew, and the crops came in, and the seasons turned over the Red River bottoms without incident. Then, in 1817, something entered that ordinary life, and the family began keeping a private account of trouble they could not explain, and could not, at first, bring themselves to speak of aloud. The story the family told begins in a field. Sometime in 1817, John Bell was walking the edge of his own land when he saw an animal he did not recognize. In the tellings, it is a creature that does not fit together, a body like a dog, and a head that belonged to something else. He raised his gun and fired, and the animal was simply gone. Not wounded, not fled. Gone. Around the same time, his son Drury reported seeing a bird on a fence post, larger than any bird had a right to be. And Betsy said she had seen a girl in a green dress, swinging from the limb of a tree in the yard, who was not there when anyone looked again. None of these sightings frightened the family into speaking. Frontier life was full of strange animals and tricks of failing light. The Bells said nothing to their neighbors, because there was nothing yet worth saying. Then the noises came inside. They started small, the way these things are always said to start. A knocking on the outside walls after dark, a scratching, faint at first, that seemed to move along the timbers of the house. The Bells assumed, reasonably, that some person was playing a trick on them, some neighbor's boy rapping on the logs to spook the children. They went out to catch him and found no one, and the knocking came again from the other side of the house. Night after night it continued, and night after night it grew. The sounds changed. According to the family's own later account, the knocking gave way to something worse. There were sounds inside the walls like a rat gnawing at the wood of the bedposts. There were sounds like heavy chains being dragged slowly across the floorboards. There were sounds like two dogs fighting, chained together, and sounds like something being choked, and sounds of stones dropped from the ceiling. On the worst nights, the noise was said to build until the whole house shook, as if it were being struck by a storm that only touched one building on the Red River. This went on, in the tellings, for the better part of a year before the family said a word to anyone outside the house. They were a proud family with a good name. They did not want it known that something was wrong in their home. That instinct toward secrecy is one of the more human threads in the whole account, and it is one the family itself emphasized. In the telling drawn from Richard Williams Bell's supposed memory, the Bells said nothing to the children at first about what they were hearing, thinking it was the work of some mischievous person trying to frighten them, and they kept it from the neighbors longer still. A prominent family did not advertise that its house had gone strange in the night, so for months they endured it privately, going out with lights to search the yard, finding nothing, coming back inside to hear the knocking resume from a different wall. The disturbances, by the family's account, escalated across that year of silence, until the noises became too violent to hide and too frightening to bear alone. When John Bell finally broke the silence, he did what a man of his community would do. He brought in the church. He confided first in a trusted friend and neighbor, a fellow member of the congregation, and asked him to come and sit in the house and hear the thing for himself. That was the crack in the dam. Once trusted men from the community had been inside and come away shaken. The story could no longer be contained. It moved outward from neighbor to neighbor, along the slow channels of frontier gossip, and people began to arrive at the Bell farm, wanting to witness the disturbance with their own senses. What had been a family's private shame became, over the following months, the most talked about house in the county. And it was after the circle of witnesses widened, after other people were in the rooms to see it, that the disturbances took their cruelest turn. They turned physical, and they turned toward the children. Betsy suffered the worst of it. In the family's account, she was slapped hard enough to leave the print of a hand on her cheek. Her hair was pulled until she cried out, pulled by nothing, pulled while witnesses stood in the room. She was pinched and stuck with pins, and she woke screaming with welts rising on her skin. The younger boys were tormented too, though less, and the bedclothes were said to be dragged off sleeping bodies, drawn slowly from the foot of the bed, as if by careful hands, every night, until 2 or 3 in the morning. 2 people in that house were largely spared. One was John Bell Jr., the grown son, who the story says argued with the thing and was mostly left alone. The other was Lucy Bell, the mother, who in every version is not merely spared but protected, spoken of kindly by the voice, even, in the strangest tellings, brought fruit and nuts when she was ill. Because by now, in the story, there was a voice. It began, they said, as a whisper that no one could quite catch, a sound like an old woman muttering hymns just below hearing. It grew clearer. Within the world of the story, it became a full voice, a woman's voice that could speak and argue and sing, and that seemed to know everything. It quoted scripture at the family and at their minister. It repeated, word for word, the sermons preached that very morning at 2 different churches, sermons delivered at the same hour by 2 different men, more than a dozen miles apart, which the voice claimed to have attended both of. It gossiped about the private business of neighbors. It sang along, uninvited, with the hymns at the family's prayer meetings. When people asked it directly what it was, it never gave one steady answer. On one occasion, in the accounts, it said it was a spirit that had once been very happy and had been disturbed. On another, it claimed to be a spirit from everywhere at once, from heaven and hell and the earth and the air, present in any house at any time, created millions of years ago. It contradicted itself freely. It seemed, more than anything, to enjoy the audience. It teased and insulted the visitors, mimicked their voices back at them, knew things about their private lives it had no ordinary way of knowing, and held court in the dark like the star of a performance that never ended. That word, performance, is one to keep in mind, because the shape of these evenings matters. Night after night, a crowd of people gathered in a lamplit farmhouse, in a community with almost no other entertainment, and waited in the dark for a disembodied voice to speak. The voice obliged. It argued theology with ministers, and won. It recited scripture. It gossiped and joked and frightened and impressed. Whatever its source, it behaved exactly like something aware that it was being watched, something that grew bolder and more articulate as its reputation spread and its audiences grew. A skeptic notices that a phenomenon which performs for crowds and gets better at performing the more crowds it draws is behaving less like a force of nature and more like an act. That observation does not settle the case, but it belongs in any honest account of how the voice conducted itself. And when people pressed it hardest on who it was, it finally settled on a name that the whole county would remember. It answered to Kate. The name mattered, and the name is one of the places where this story quietly reveals what it really is. In the neighborhood, there lived a woman named Kate Batts. She was real. She was a living person, a neighbor of the Bells, and by some accounts connected to Lucy Bell's own family. Kate Batts was known in the community as eccentric, sharp-tongued, the kind of woman a frightened rural community will fix on when it needs a human face for its fear. In the story, there had been bad blood, a soured business dealing between the Batts family and John Bell, and so, as the disturbances grew, the community began to say that the voice was the witch of Kate Batts, sent to torment the man who had wronged her. The voice, in the tellings, embraced the name, but underneath the legend, what the record shows is plainer and sadder. A living woman, with a name and a face, and neighbors of her own, became the scapegoat for something happening in a house that was not hers. That is not a haunting. That is what fear does to a small community when it cannot explain what it sees. As the story spread, the Bell farm filled with strangers. People came from miles around, in wagons and on horseback, to sit in the Bell house after dark and wait for the voice to speak. Ministers came to pray over the family. Neighbors came to test it, to shout questions into the dark and marvel when the dark answered back. The Bells, who had kept the trouble secret for a year out of shame, now found their home turned into something between a church and a sideshow, full most nights of curious faces lit by the fire. One of those visitors, in the most famous version of the legend, was Andrew Jackson. The story goes that Jackson, who owned land in the region and would one day be president, heard the tales and came out to the Bell farm with a party of men to see the witch for himself. His wagon, they said, stuck fast on the road to the house, the wheels frozen by an unseen force no matter how the horses strained, until the voice laughed and told him he could pass. It is a wonderful story. It is also a story with no documentation whatsoever. No record from Jackson, no letter, no diary, no contemporary account places him at the Bell farm. It appears in print for the first time in the same late book that gave the world most of the rest of the legend, and there is no reason, in the historical record, to believe it happened. It is included here because it is part of the story people tell. It is flagged here because part of the promise of this account is telling the difference. The wider claim about witnesses deserves the same careful handling. The tellings insist that hundreds of people passed through the Bell house across those years, that ministers prayed over the family and came away convinced, that respected men of the community testified to what they had heard. And it is entirely possible that a great many people did visit an isolated farmhouse where something strange was reported to be happening. Curiosity is old and human, and a talking voice in the dark would have drawn crowds in any century. But there is a difference between a crowd of curious visitors and a crowd of documented witnesses. When the historians go looking for those witnesses, for their own words, set down at the time, saying what they saw, the crowd thins to almost nothing. The hundreds who supposedly filled the Bell house left no letters that survived to say so. Their testimony reaches us only through a book written long after they were dead, which asserts that they were there and speaks for them. A story can be famous for the size of its audience and still leave no proof that the audience ever existed. Through all of this, across all 3 years, the voice kept its attention fixed on one person above all others, not Betsy, John Bell. The thing in the walls, in the family's account, hated the father of the house with a particular and patient hatred. It cursed him. It called him Old Jack. It promised, over and over, that it would kill him, and it told him it was in no hurry. And beginning around the same time the voice grew strong, John Bell's body began to fail. This is the part of the story that is not folklore. This is documented as a real death of a real man, whatever the cause. John Bell developed a strange affliction of the face and mouth. His tongue swelled so that eating and speaking became difficult. The muscles of his face would go rigid, locked and twitching, and then fall slack. He suffered what the accounts describe as a kind of jerking in the muscles, spells of it, and a growing weakness that kept him more and more to his bed. Modern readers have offered guesses at what it might have been: some disorder of the nerves, some condition of the face and throat that medicine of the 1820s had no name for. The honest answer is that no one living can diagnose a man dead for 2 centuries from a handful of second-hand descriptions. What can be said is this: John Bell was genuinely, physically, seriously ill for a long time, and his family watched it happen, and they had already decided what was doing it to him. That last point is the one that matters most, and it is the one the ghost story quietly conceals. By the time John Bell's face began to twitch and lock, the household had already spent months, and then years, living inside the certainty that an unseen enemy was in the house and meant them harm. So when the man of the family began to sicken, there was no neutral ground on which to understand it. Every symptom arrived pre-interpreted. A swollen tongue was not a swollen tongue. It was the work of the voice that had promised to kill him. A seizure of the facial muscles was not a medical event to be treated. It was an attack. A family watching a beloved father decline from some disorder of the nerves, in a place and time with no medicine that could name it, and no doctor who could stop it, reached for the explanation their whole ordeal had already taught them to reach for. The voice had said it would kill Old Jack. Now Old Jack was dying. To the people in that house, watching helplessly, the connection was not a theory. It was the plain and terrible truth in front of them. In December of 1820, he took to his bed and did not rise again. On the morning of December the 20th, John Bell was found unresponsive, and he died that day. And here the story delivers its darkest single image, the one that has kept it alive for 200 years. In the cupboard, the family found a small vial of dark liquid that no one could account for. In the account, the voice spoke up gloating and claimed that it had given Old Jack a heavy dose of the stuff while he slept, and that this was what had finished him. One of the sons is said to have taken the vial and thrown its contents into the fire, where the liquid flared up in a blue flame and shot up the chimney. And at the funeral, before the whole grieving community, the voice was said to laugh and sing, loud and crude, drinking songs over the open grave, until John Bell was in the ground. That is the story the Bell family believed. A patriarch killed by a spirit, poisoned in his sleep, mocked into his grave. It is a genuinely frightening story, and for most of 2 centuries it has been told exactly that way, as a true account of a real haunting on the Tennessee frontier. The trouble begins when a person goes looking for where the story actually comes from, because a story this famous, this detailed, this full of exact quotations and specific nights ought to leave a trail. There ought to be letters. There ought to be a diary entry from one of the hundreds of visitors. There ought to be a newspaper account from 1818 or 1820, when the county was supposedly full of people who had heard the voice with their own ears. And when historians go looking for that contemporary trail, for anything written down while John Bell was still alive or freshly buried, they find almost nothing at all. There are no contemporary sources for the Bell Witch. That single fact reshapes the entire case. The most famous haunting in American history, an event supposedly witnessed by hundreds of named people across 3 years, left no confirmed written record at the time it was happening. The earliest datable, independent, printed mention of the whole affair does not appear until 1886. That year, the Goodspeed Publishing Company issued a large History of Tennessee, organized county by county, the kind of subscription book that captured local lore alongside local facts. In the Robertson County section, there is a short passage describing a remarkable occurrence connected with the family of John Bell near Adams Station. It is brief, but it is the first solid footprint in the record, and it lands 66 years after John Bell was buried. There are a few fainter marks earlier than that, and honesty requires naming them, because they cut against the idea that the story was invented whole cloth in the 1890s. Folklorists and researchers digging through old print have turned up scattered references that may point back toward the Bell affair. There is an article from 1856 in the Saturday Evening Post that discusses a Tennessee ghost. There is a journal entry from 1820, the very year John Bell died, kept by a man named Captain John R. Fuller Bell, an Army officer passing through the region on an expedition, who wrote of hearing about a girl on the Red River associated with a strange ventriloquist voice. These are not proof of a haunting. They are something more modest and more interesting. They are evidence that a story about a talking bell ghost, tied to a girl on the Red River, was already circulating in the general area, in some form, well before any book fixed it in print. The tale was real as a tale, moving through the oral world of the upland South for decades. What did not exist, in any solid and checkable form, was the detailed, dated, quotation-filled version that everyone now knows. That version had to wait for a writer to build it. The book that actually created the Bell Witch as the world knows it came 8 years after that. In 1894, a newspaper publisher in Clarksville, Tennessee, named Martin Van Buren Ingram, brought out a volume with a long and confident title, An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch. Nearly every modern retelling of the story, every documentary, every article, every campfire version, traces back through Ingram's book. The vivid details, the quoted sermons, the vial in the cupboard, the songs at the funeral, the name Kate, the wagon stuck on the road. Most of it, in the form people know it, comes from Ingram, writing 3/4 of a century after the events. And Ingram knew that a book published in 1894 about a haunting in 1817 needed something to stand on, so he offered his readers a source. He claimed that the heart of his book, the intimate day-by-day account of the disturbances, came from a manuscript written by John Bell's own son. The son was Richard Williams Bell, who had been a young boy in the house during the disturbances. According to Ingram, Richard had written down the whole family ordeal decades later, around 1846, in a document titled Our Family Trouble, and Ingram was simply bringing that eyewitness manuscript to light. It is a persuasive claim, and it did exactly what Ingram needed it to do: an eyewitness account, written by a man who had been in the house. If it existed, it would be the closest thing the story has to a primary source. No one has ever produced it. The manuscript Ingram cited, the eyewitness document at the foundation of the entire legend, has never been independently found, verified, or examined by anyone outside of Ingram's own book. It exists only inside the pages that depend on it. A reader has nothing to check Ingram against except Ingram. And when investigators have looked closely at the text he supposedly transcribed, they have found reasons for real doubt. The most careful, skeptical examination of the case was done by the investigator Joe Nickel, who spent a career looking hard at exactly these kinds of stories. Nickel pointed to language and ideas inside the Bell Witch narrative that do not belong to the frontier of 1817. He noted the presence of concepts and turns of phrase that fit the second half of the 19th century far better than the first. The era of spiritualism and seances and talking spirits that swept America after 1848, decades after John Bell died. A voice that behaves like a Victorian seance spirit is a strange thing to find in an account supposedly describing 1818. Nickel's conclusion was blunt. The evidence for the Bell Witch is late, it is second-hand, and it comes filtered through the pens of writers with clear reasons to make the story as gripping as possible. A skeptic, he pointed out, does not have to prove that a ghost was absent. He only has to notice that all the testimony arrived generations after the fact, from people with books to sell. There is a further wrinkle in Nickel's reading that deserves its own moment, because it goes to the heart of when this story was really shaped. The Bell Witch, as written, does not behave like a frontier haunting of 1817. It behaves like a spirit out of the seance parlor. It converses at length. It answers questions about the nature of the afterlife. It performs for a seated audience and enjoys the attention. That is the signature of American spiritualism, the seance craze that swept the country beginning in 1848, with its rapping spirits and its talking dead and its parlor mediums. All of that came into fashion decades after John Bell was in the ground. A voice that acts like a Victorian medium's spirit guide is a jarring thing to find in an account that claims to describe 1818, and it points, quietly but firmly, at the 1890s as the era in which the story took the form we know, rather than the 1810s. The retellings kept coming after Ingram, and each one added its own weight. The story also drew the attention of serious folklorists. In 1934, two scholars, Arthur Palmer Hudson and Pete Kyle McCarter, published a study of the Bell Witch in the Journal of American Folklore, tracing it not as a haunting to be proved or disproved, but as a folk legend to be understood, a story that had grown and traveled and changed in the telling across a century, following the Bell family's own migration from Tennessee into Mississippi. That same year, 1934, a descendant named Charles Bailey Bell published a family version of the story, carrying it forward as inherited truth from the Bell side of the line. Then, in 1937, the newspapers seized on the legend again in a burst of coverage, a season the press treated almost as a return of the witch herself, and the story reached a national audience larger than it had ever had. Each retelling borrowed from the last. Each one presented the tale as more established, more certain, more authenticated, precisely because it had been told so many times before. That is how a legend hardens, not through evidence, but through repetition. So the question at the center of this case is not whether a ghost was real. The question is what actually happened inside the Bell home for those 3 years, underneath a story that was assembled, decades later, by people who were not there. Strip away the parts that trace only to Ingram, and a different account remains, and it is not empty. It is, in some ways, sadder and more human than the ghost. There was a real family, prosperous and proud, and tied tightly to a demanding faith. There was a real adolescent girl at the exact age when the body and the mind are in upheaval, living in a crowded house, becoming, whether she willed it or not, the focus of the entire community's attention every single night. There was a real, dying father, wasting away over years from an affliction of the nerves and the face that no frontier doctor could name or stop. And there was a real religious community, steeped in a worldview where affliction could be the work of an unseen enemy, primed to hear a spiritual attack in every knock on the wall and every convulsion of a sick man's face. Some investigators have gone further and suggested that parts of the disturbances were staged, whether by a troubled girl at the center of a family under strain, or by someone else in the household with a reason of their own. One old theory even proposed a local school teacher, in love with Betsy, manufacturing terror to drive off a rival for her hand. These are guesses, and they should be named as guesses, but they all point in the same direction, toward a human explanation for a human tragedy. A family that could not save a dying man gathered around an ordinary girl in a community that gave their fear a name and a shape, and eventually, a book. Kate Batts kept living her life. Whatever became of her, she was a real woman whose name was borrowed, without her leave, to carry the dread of an entire county. That is one more small injustice folded quietly into the famous story, and it deserves to be said out loud. And the family, the actual Bell family, did what most families do after a death. They went on. John Bell was buried near his home in December of 1820. The disturbances, in the family's account, did not end at once with him. Through the following winter and into the spring of 1821, the voice was said to turn its full attention to Betsy and to her engagement to a young man named Joshua Gardner. It tormented her about the match, followed her, threatened her, until at last, in the spring of 1821, Betsy broke off the engagement. Not long after, the voice was said to announce that it was leaving and to promise a return in 7 years, and then to fall silent. The acute years, the 3 years that centered on John Bell and ended with his death, were over. The legend did not quite let the family go, though, and the coda is part of the record of what people believed. 7 years on, In 1828, the story holds that the voice returned, this time not to torment but to talk, visiting John Bell Jr. and spending a handful of nights in long, calm conversation about the past and the future and the nature of things, before departing again with a stranger promise. It would come back, it said, in 107 years. That would have placed its return in 1935. When 1935 arrived, nothing happened. No documented return, no new disturbance. Only a date on a calendar that a legend had marked more than a century in advance, and then failed to keep. It is a fitting end for a promise made by a voice that lived, in the end, on paper. Betsy Bell did not vanish into the legend. She lived a long, full, documented life. In time, she married a man named Richard Powell, who had been a schoolteacher in the community, and she moved with him away from the Red River, settling eventually in Mississippi. She raised a family. She grew old. She died in Mississippi, decades after the winter her father died, an elderly woman who had spent her whole adult life as the living answer to a mystery that would outlast her by a century and more. The frightened 11-year-old at the center of America's most famous ghost story became, in the end, simply an old woman far from Tennessee, carrying whatever she actually remembered into a grave of her own. The other Bell children scattered into ordinary lives, into farms and marriages and children of their own, in Robertson County and beyond. The family, despite what it had called our family trouble, went on flourishing, and descendants of John and Lucy Bell were still living across the South and the Midwest generations later. The name did not die. If anything, the trouble made it immortal. The farm itself is gone, the original house long since torn down, but the place at Adams, Tennessee, never let the story go. There is a cave in a bluff above the Red River, near where the farm stood, that local tradition has tied to the witch for well over a century, though there is nothing in the actual record connecting the disturbances to the cave at all. There is a state historical marker along the highway. There are tours and visitors from around the world, and a whole small economy grown up around a talking voice that first reached a wide audience in a book published in 1894. The cave is worth a closer look, because it shows how a legend keeps growing new limbs long after the story is over. For well over a century, local tradition has held that when the voice left the Bell house, it took up residence in the cave in the bluff above the river, and generations of visitors have gone down into that limestone passage, half hoping to feel something. The connection is pure folklore. There is nothing in the actual accounts of the disturbances, not in Ingram, not anywhere, that ties the events on the farm to the cave at all. The cave became part of the story simply because it was there, near the site, dark and cold and dramatic, exactly the kind of place a legend wants for its final chapter. That is how these stories work. They accrete. Each generation adds the detail it finds most satisfying and hands the enlarged version to the next, and after enough generations, the additions are indistinguishable from the original. Today, there is a state historical marker along the highway at Adams, noting the site of Tennessee's most famous ghost tale. There are tours. There is a replica cabin, and the cave with its guided walks, and visitors who come from other countries to stand where the Bell farm stood. An entire small economy has grown up around a voice that first reached a wide audience in a subscription book in 1894, and the story is genuinely taught in some form as a piece of regional heritage, passed to children in the county as part of who they are and where they come from. 2 centuries on, more people believe in the Bell Witch than ever heard of her, while John Bell was alive. What actually happened inside the Bell family home for those 3 years was a slow, terrible, ordinary human thing. A father sickened and died. A family suffered and could not stop it. A frightened community reached for the only explanation its faith offered, and pinned the blame on the witch of a living neighbor. And 70 years later, long after everyone who had been in that house was beyond contradicting anyone, a newspaperman gathered the scattered lore, attached it to a manuscript no one else has ever seen, and gave the whole aching story the one thing it had always lacked: a shape, a voice, a name. The most disturbing thing about the Bell Witch was never the ghost. It was how easily the truth of a dying man and a frightened girl could be buried under a legend, and how long it could stay buried, and how many people would rather keep the ghost than dig for what the record actually holds.